Evening, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, you're coming through loud and clear. It is my privilege this evening to be joined by Stephen Singular, the author of the recent book, Legacy of Deception, subtitled An Investigation of Mark Furman and Racism in the LAPD. Book is published in softcover by Dove Books, copyright 1995. Stephen, welcome to our airwaves.
Well, thank you for having me.
Your book actually is about far more than just Mark Furman and racism in the LAPD. In fact, I would say that Mark Furman plays a relatively small part in your book. The author Edith Wharton observed, Stephen, that in a frivolous society can only achieve dramatic significance through what its frivolity destroys. And I think that in connection with the OJ Simpson case, our society has proved itself to be altogether frivolous, and it has destroyed a great deal, including some very serious information, which you have effectively and courageously highlighted, that OJ Simpson was framed. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came into possession of the information that you did?
Well, in 1984, I was living in Denver, Colorado. I had been kind of a radio junkie for many years. I had moved to Colorado a few years before that and became fascinated with a radio personality named Alan Berg, who was a prominent figure there on the radio. And in June of 1984, he was assassinated by a group of neo-Nazis from the northwest of America. They were all subsequently rounded up, tried in Seattle, and convicted, or they pled guilty, and most of them are now in federal penitentiaries.
This group, by the way, was named the Order.
Yes, it was, and it was led by a man named Robert Matthews, who was killed in a shootout with the FBI at the end of 1984. At the time, before the Oklahoma City bombing, these people were essentially responsible for 3 or 4 deaths. They robbed $4.6 million in one heist in Northern California and committed 270, I believe it was 270 criminal acts. Anyway, the point of all of that is that an investigation of FBI and police personnel was conducted throughout the United States to round these people up. I made a lot of contacts, got to know a lot of people, wrote my book. It came out in 1987. It was called Talk to Death, The Life and Murder of Alan Berg. And I stayed in touch with some of the sources that I developed at that time in the mid-1980s. There was, of course, a lot of research being done by police and other officials into right-wing organizations, white supremacist organizations, and groups like that. When the murders occurred in Brentwood here in Los Angeles in June of 1994, I watched what followed that. I, like 90 million other Americans, watched a high-speed chase, watched Simpson taken into custody, etc., and came to what I believe was what appeared to be the conclusion that he was a guilty man. 6 weeks passed after that to late July of 1994, and I was contacted by a source that I had made 10 years earlier, roughly, a source connected to the legal system out here.
Out here being in Los Angeles?
Southern California, and was told that there were several critical pieces of evidence in this case that basically had not surfaced that would go a long way toward explaining what had happened, at least in one aspect of the case, the aspect being what the police had done.
You mentioned that a stick and a blue evidence bag found respectively on OJ's property and adjacent to it figured prominently in this scenario. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, this was the first week of August now of 1994, and I was given 4 pieces of information at that time. One is that there was a piece of broken fence that was germane to the case. 2 was that there was a blue plastic evidence bag that was germane to the case. Both are recovered. One was recovered near the Ford Bronco. The stick was recovered near the Ford Bronco by the police, and the bag was recovered over near where the glove had been found on Simpson's estate. If you recall the pictures of all of that, there's his house, there's the walkway, there's a chain link fence, and on the other side of the fence there's a blue plastic object lying on the ground. I was told that was an evidence bag, which is something that homicide detectives take with them when they go to crime scenes. We know from preliminary hearing testimony that, in fact, Detective Furman and Detective Phillips, who were the first homicide detectives to arrive on the scene had a homicide kit in their trunk that contained plastic bags. I didn't know, and I was also told that blood had been planted in this case, and the only thing needed to prove that was to test the blood, the crime scene blood, and perhaps other blood for a preservative. Technically, it's called an anticoagulant. It's called EDTA. It's a preservative in blood, so it won't coagulate when you put it in a vial. You draw blood from a suspect, you put it in a vial. You don't want it to harden or get dry, so there's a preservative in there. If Simpson's blood had been planted, it would have had to have come out of that vial. If it were tested and it had EDTA in it, it would clearly mean that it had, in fact, been planted. The fourth piece of information I was given was that Detective Mark Furman had known Nicole Simpson fairly well prior to these crimes. We all know he'd gone over to Simpson's estate once in 1985. He testified, or he wrote a report in 1989 that this made an indelible impression on him. But that's the end of the story, basically. I was told that he was in somewhat of regular communication with her, that he was her cop on the force, that she told him about her relationship with OJ in depth, and the point of all that being that he did not arrive at the crime scene as any kind of a blank slate, as a homicide investigator would be expected to do.
Now, we should stress that none of this has ever been firmly established, and I shouldn't say none of this, but with regard to the situation vis-a-vis Furman and the Simpson family. Has there ever been any objective finding in a court of law?
What happened in that example is, we can go through the four pieces of information one at a time, but what happened was that to sort of give you a narrative progression, I got the information, I didn't quite know what to do with it. I was told that approaching the prosecution would not do any good. Nobody was going to listen to me, and I was just going to get into trouble. So I approached the defense and put these things in a fax. And I faxed it to Johnny Cochran's office on August 4th of 94, and 4 days later I was sitting in Shapiro's office with Carl Douglas, who was Cochran's second in command, and with Bill Pavlik, who was their lead investigator. I gave them those four pieces of information. I told Pavlik and Douglas that Furman knew Nicole Simpson, and Pavlik was all over me. He's a tough ex-cop from L.A. who thought he knew everything about the case and probably did know more than anybody. And he said he'd looked at all the clubs and all around to see if they did have a connection, and he couldn't find one. But to answer your question, is that the trial began in January of 1995, as we all know.
Right.
In February of 1995, the LAPD began conducting their own internal affairs investigation of Mark Furman because enough stuff had come out about him to at least make them conduct a token investigation, which is what it essentially amounted to. What happened was that, the crimes were committed in June of 94. The preliminary hearing was in July. In August and July of 94, deputy district attorneys, two by name, Lucien Coleman and Julie Segosian, came forward to the district attorney's office, to Marsha Clark, to Bill Hodgman, to Garcetti, to the people in charge, and said a couple of things. One is that police themselves had approached these deputy DAs and had told them about Furman being at parties, Furman being at other locations, and talking about, for one example, Nicole Simpson's breast implants. He was bragging about seeing them. He was talking about it with other cops. What does that tell you? Does that tell you that they had a relationship? I don't know, but it tells me that there was something in what I was being told. When other policemen were coming forward talking to the deputy DAs in turn were going to the higher-ups and saying, look, this is not normal behavior. Regardless of what happened, this man may very well have had an incentive to do the kinds of things that were now being talked about by the defense.
We should note that this was discussed in an article that appeared on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, albeit near the bottom where an awful lot of people don't look. I don't recall the possible issue of Furman and Nicole as romantic or possible romantic or sexual partners coming out in court. There were reports in the papers, but what I was driving at is that most of the rest of the information that you had been given did come out to one extent or another, and frequently obliquely during the course of the trial, yet it was virtually ignored even by the participants.
Well, what happened was that the stick Furman had mentioned a stick in the preliminary hearing. It was connected to absolutely nothing. It was, when I went back and looked at his preliminary hearing testimony, I found that he was talking about this, and which struck me as very curious. I talked about that with the defense. Then as the trial began, I'm leaving out many details, one of which is that I wrote all of this up in a book proposal, which was then leaked to everybody, including the prosecuting attorneys and the defense attorneys and the judge, so that they all sort of knew some of the things that the defense was going to do in the trial. They knew the stick had become an issue by the fall of 1994. So when Furman took the stand in March of 95, you may recall that Marcia Clark would like to end each Friday. They would quit on Friday at noon, and she would like to end it with something very dramatic. They would bring out a glove, or they would bring out, there was that fiasco with the plastic bag that was in the Bronco, which happened to be a standard issue item. They thought it was a body bag or something. But anyway, one Friday they brought this object wrapped in brown paper and set it in front of Mark Furman, and he unwrapped it, and it was this piece of stick. But what was it? Nobody ever said, where did it come from? I was told it came from a fence over at the Bundy address at the crime scene, that he broke a piece of stick off of the fence there, that he picked up the glove with the stick, that he put the stick in a blue plastic evidence bag, that he transported the bag, the glove, the stick over to Rockingham, that he dropped the glove on the ground, that he got rid of the stick in the bag. We know these objects exist. We know the stick was introduced in court. We know that the defense introduced the picture of the blue plastic bag to the jury also in February when Cochran was cross-examining one of the homicide detectives.
This plastic bag lying right on the other side of a cyclone fence from where the infamous bloody glove was found.
Was found at Simpson's estate.
And this was actually a blue evidence bag of the type that detectives carry in an evidence kit.
That is my understanding. I never held it in my hand, but I do know that Cochran introduced it into evidence with that. And then Bailey, when Bailey was cross-examining Furman, went into this whole thing about if you put a glove into a blue plastic bag, what would happen with it? See, I got close to the defense, and Carl Douglas gave me the preliminary hearing transcripts of Furman and Vanatter, which they gave in July of 1994. I studied Furman's testimony very clearly. He says several things in there that should have been pursued much more strongly than they were. One thing he says in there, off the top of his head, about arriving at the crime scene, is that he knew that Nicole and OJ had joint custody of their children. How does he know that? How can a homicide detective possibly know that, talking about arriving at a crime scene? What does that tell you? This is an admission from his own mouth. The point of the plastic bag was that it would dry, a glove would dry if it were sitting on the ground for 7 or 8 hours if it were not wrapped in something. This was according to F. Lee Bailey during the trial. The point I'm making is that the stick entered the trial, the bag entered the trial. The report of the LAPD investigation did surface very late in the trial, but it was not really, it did not really get much in front of the jury. But the most interesting issue of all, by far, was the blood preservative, because that played a crucial role in the trial.
Now, this EDTA preservative is apparently something that is placed as a matter of course and for the purposes desired for EDTA in a particular type of vial that is color-coded by cap, is it not?
There are 3 types of vials, and there are 3 types of preservatives. There's a green, a yellow, and a purple capped vial. Yellow and green have something called sulfurin or heparate, and I believe I pronounced that correctly. I'm not a chemist. When I was originally given this information, as I told you, in late July of '94, one of the first things I did was contact a blood specialist at a hospital in Denver, a man named Dr. Dan Ambruso, who's a hematologist. I had asked around for some people, and they said, this man knows more about blood and testing blood than anybody you're going to meet. So I called him up, and he explained to me about these caps, about blood preservatives, about what they do. He told me that EDTA was a stable compound, and that means that it would be in the blood, long after it came out of the vial. It would not dissolve, so you could test that blood for a long time afterward and still find the chemical in there. which was a good thing for my purposes. I took all of this information and gave it to the defense, and my general thrust was to get them to test the blood. If that chemical was in there, then we could fairly safely assume that we knew at least a portion of what happened in this case. I mean, that's a provable thing. If you talk to any organic chemist, he'll tell you that.
How did the defense react to your information?
They told me I was wrong about everything. They told me I was wasting their time. It's a very interesting story. It's laid out in the book. I rather naively thought, well, they'll embrace this information. They may even embrace me. Because if this stuff is true, then you get beyond speculation. You get into some hard evidentiary stuff that could really show you some severe police misconduct.
Now, again, the significance of this EDTA is not as obscure as it might appear at first glance. Its presence in some of the blood samples supposedly left by OJ Simpson at various elements of the crime pathway, I guess one could say, would positively prove that blood had been planted from the sample that OJ had given to the police.
Correct. That's correct.
And this would have obviously proved that OJ Simpson had been framed.
That's correct. If you could test it and if you could get definitive answers. I went to the defense to back up a little bit. They said, A, Furman and Nicole did not know each other. B, we've never heard of a stick. C, we've never heard of a blue plastic bag. D, this blood preservative theory is crazy. We can't get our hands on the blood to test it, and if we could, we don't think it's in there anyway. So go back to Denver and have a nice life.
That initial response was not altogether, shall we say, not altogether ingenuous.
No, and it wasn't. It was not. But anyway, I was not willing to just take no for an answer and just go home and resume my former life. I thought if this were true, it had to come out, period. So I began to establish a relationship with Carl Douglas, again, the second command in Cochrane's office, and was calling him 2 or 3 times a week and was actually able to get my hands on more information and pass it along to him. He went to his evidence book, his murder book, as they're called in criminal trials, and he opened it up and he started thumbing through it. And lo and behold, he found a picture of a blue plastic bag sitting next to a cyclone fence, and he found a piece of stick sitting on the ground next to the Bronco. At that point, I began to be able to get him on the phone a little more easily, and we began to be able to talk to one another, and he started to trust me a little bit. When I arrived in their offices on August 8th, as Carl emphatically pointed out to me, they had 200,000 leads. They had 200,000 tips, and most of them were, they dismissed them out of hand. He said, we've taken about 100 seriously, and we've sat down and talked to 10 or 15 people. So, you've accomplished something by getting into our office, but we've got to go further. So we did go further, and as I said, some of these things began to check out. So what I did was gather a lot more information on EDTA, how you would test for it, what the test is called. It's called gas chromatography. It essentially separates the EDTA out from the blood, and so you can see that it's in there. And I, again, established more and more of a relationship with Carl in particular. And then what happened is, the story just gets more and more complex, but they began to believe that something had gone on in the crime lab with Simpson's stored blood, and the essence of it was that at a crime scene, the criminalists, as you'll recall in this case, the infamous Fung and Mazzola, go over to a crime scene and take swatches and pick up blood. This gets rather complicated, but the blood preservative theory was shot down by everybody because a number of police officers arrived at that scene and saw that blood on the ground while Simpson was still in Chicago. So if you follow what I'm saying, in other words, you had maybe 10 police officers there who walked through the scene and saw this blood on the ground, and they all testified to that. So that clearly could not have come out of the vial yet, because the vial with the blood in it did not yet exist. When I went to the defense, I said simply, you have to check the crime scene blood. I didn't have any information beyond that. What they did beyond that was to come up with the belief that in fact that blood was collected off the ground, that blood does belong to somebody, but that's not the blood that was sent off to Cellmark for the DNA testing. And if you'll recall Dr. Lee testifying at the trial, that was the essence of what he had to say. I mean, he's generally considered to be the most respected forensic scientist in the world.
Let's recap here just for a second,
Yeah.
Stephen. Cellmark Diagnostics was the laboratory that was actually doing the DNA test.
Correct.
On some of the blood given by OJ Simpson and stored in that purple cap vial characterized by an EDTA preservative.
Well,
in other words, the blood that was in the vial would have to have had EDTA in it.
Here, let me try and break it down into sort of the theory of the case from the defense's point of view and perhaps from the prosecution's point of view. The critical pieces of evidence in this case, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many, were blood drops 47 through 52 because those were the crime scene blood drops. If Simpson's blood is on the ground at that crime scene, there's a pretty fair chance that he committed these crimes. And that blood was collected before he came back from Chicago and gave his blood. And then some Simpson blood was sent off to Cellmark. The implications from Dr. Lee's testimony were that those blood swatches were switched because Andrea Mazzola's initials were not on the swatches that were sent off, which was considered very important to them, and because that's what they believe happened, and that's very much in line with what I was told happened. What happened was, as the case went on, and they began to believe in the blood preservative theory and the fact that Simpson's blood had been planted, they came to me and they said, "Do you know anybody in the crime lab?" And I said, "Well, I can look into it." And they said, "We have reason to believe that some crime lab employee, maybe on orders from above, has taken some of that stored blood and has put it on clean swatches, not the crime scene swatches, but new swatches, and they've sent those off to Cellmark. If they sent those off to Cellmark, they could only come back as O.J. Simpson's DNA. I mean, there's no other way because it is Simpson's blood. And the tests that Cellmark runs are not tests for EDTA. They're simply tests for DNA, and those tests are not, the same. So I came out to Los Angeles. I was living in Denver at the time, and I approached somebody in the crime lab, and I tried to make headway with what they were asking me to do, and then the story gets a little more complicated and hairy from there because basically they were trying to get me to do some things that were a little bit questionable, as I subsequently found out. And I really decided that I'd probably gone about as far with them as I wanted to. I was not, as I say in the book, going to stand in the bushes down at the criminal, down at the crime lab and try and jump somebody and get them to talk to me on their behalf.
It certainly wouldn't be a good idea given the publicity for this case. Stephen, I'd like to sum up a few of the points that we've made in this half hour, then take a short break, and we will continue within our next half-hour segment. You wrote a book called Talk to Death, the basis for Oliver Stone's 1988 or 9 film called Talk Radio, about the murder of Alan Berg by the neo-Nazi group The Order. And you were contacted by a source within the L.A. legal system and told that there had apparently been a number of different elements of fabrication of evidence against O.J. Simpson, including the planting of a glove involving a stick to scoop it up and a blue plastic evidence bag to carry it over. A stick was found near the Bronco at O.J.'s property. A blue plastic object, apparently a bag, was found just on the other side of a cyclone fence adjoining O.J.'s property where the glove was found. And you were told that blood had been planted at the crime scene and that also perhaps swatches of blood from the crime scene had been switched for swatches taken from O.J.'s blood sample. A lot of this panned out during the course of the trial. One of the things that's amazing to me is that Carl Douglas showed you a picture from the evidence book of the blue glove and of the stick, and then Johnny Cochran actually mentioned the blue plastic object, not the blue glove, but the blue bag. Johnny Cochran actually mentioned the blue plastic object at one point during the trial, and yet it was never brought up. Stephen, what I'd like to do would be to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to continue with an examination of the fascinating and very important, though sadly overlooked information in your very important, though sadly overlooked book, Legacy of Deception. I've been speaking with Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, softcover Dove Books, copyright 1995. We will be back with Stephen Singular and a discussion of his book in the next half-hour segment. Good evening, hello. It is once again my pleasure to be joined by Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, about the apparent framing of OJ Simpson. The book was published in softcover by Dove Books, copyright 1995. Welcome back once again to our airwaves, Stephen.
Good to be here.
We've been talking about the information that was provided to you by a source within the Los Angeles legal system about the apparent framing of O.J. Simpson. One of the central points of evidence, one of the central bones of contention, I should say, concerns some swatches of blood that were apparently taken at the crime scene and yet may have been switched by way of a transition. Why don't you sum up briefly what that particular point of information detailed and Henry Lee's perspective on that during the trial?
Right. Well, as I had said earlier, I had gone to the defense in early August of '94 and pushed quite hard on this blood preservative theory and said that they should get their hands on the blood and they should test it, and had initially met resistance on this, but over time they began to look into it and take it quite seriously. What happened is that we had sort of a parting of the ways over some of these other issues I was mentioning earlier, and I went back to Denver and decided to write a few pages of my experience and send it out to someone and see if they might be interested in having me write a book about this. I have written several books about true crime situations, and I sent it out here, and the information was leaked to all of the major players in the case. It went to the prosecutors, it went to the judge, and it went to the defense. And this, in my mind at least, has quite a lot of relevance to the case. Because what happened is that I had essentially outlined what the defense was going to present in their case when the trial actually started. And Chris Darden, in his new book, In Contempt, essentially says exactly the same thing, that he saw the book proposal in November of '94, and he said here was the blueprint for what the defense was going to do long before the trial started. It came from me before the information had become known or become public. The point of all of that is that in February of 1995, Rocky Harmon, who was a prosecuting attorney and somewhat of a scientific blood expert, stood up in court and said to Judge Ito, look, there is this silly rumor going around that blood was planted in this case and that can be proven by a preservative being in the blood. This is ridiculous. We are going to disprove that. We are going to take it upon ourselves to disprove this theory definitively by bringing in the FBI and having them test certain parts of blood for EDTA. And he in fact had written a letter to the FBI saying that that's what they wanted the FBI to do, to essentially shatter this theory. That's not exactly the way you would set up an objective experiment, but that was essentially the language that was used. So this became rather public at that time. Judge Ito said, great, let's get the FBI, let's get in here and do these tests. This was on February 3rd of 1995. I don't think it's a coincidence that, having read the book proposal and studied it, and perhaps from other sources, they knew that the defense was going to use this strategy. So, in fact, they did call in the FBI, and they did run tests. Now, they did not test the crime scene blood swatches. That's a very important point for people to understand. They tested blood on Simpson's socks, found it at his home. That was a fairly prominent part of the case. And they tested blood that was on a back gate at the crime scene. They did not test those particular blood drops, 47 through 52, that I had referred to earlier. Now, interestingly enough, 3 months passed. The FBI, although the prosecution continued to put on their case, the FBI were never called as witnesses. In early May of 1995, Rodney Harmon again stood in front of the judge and talked about gas chromatography tests. The same thing I had written about in the book proposal, the same thing I had described to Carl Douglas 7 or 8 months earlier about how you find EDTA. He had the results of the FBI tests by that time, and he told the judge, outside of the presence of the jury, that yes, indeed, the defense did have what he called a sliver of hope based upon those test results. At which point the defense team burst into smiles because they knew that there was evidence from those two testings that something was in that blood.
And testimony, although the defense was not actually allowed to conduct their own independent tests, but rather to observe the results. Is that correct?
Exactly.
And the individual who testified on behalf of the defense was an expert on EDTA, Dr. Jürgen Riegers.
Frederick Riegers.
Excuse me.
A man from Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And he said, and I think I'm accurate, he said, there's the strongest possible evidence. I think that's almost an exact quote.
That was an unfortunate slip on my part. That's actually a German Nazi attorney who's defended people associated, such as Gary Lauck, associated with some of these international Nazi networks that we'll touch on a little later. So that was a singularly unfortunate, no pun intended, mistake on my part. Frederick Riegers was the individual.
Riegers testified on behalf of the defense when they began putting on their case in July and said, based upon 40 years of experience of blood testing, and based upon looking at these test results, I conclusively believe that EDTA is in this blood. Now, as I said earlier, the prosecution did not call Roger Marks, the special agent who had conducted the test, but the defense did, and on direct examination, I believe with defense attorney Robert Blazer, he said, I have found something consistent with EDTA in these blood samples. Subsequently, Marcia Clark cross-examined him, and he began to change his testimony. But I think one could conclude from all of this that something was found. It's not even his testimony that is as important as the fact that the prosecution went out of their way, brought in the FBI, got the judge's approval, spent the public's money, conducted the test, and never called him as a witness. That tells you what you need to know about the blood in this case. Now, we do, as I said, the crime scene blood swatches, which is what I believe now should be tested. If that blood still exists and still could be tested, I believe it should be tested right now, and that's one of the things I would like to see done. Because what happened is, as I said earlier, that swatches were collected from the crime scene. They were very fresh. It was probably 10 or 11 hours after the crimes on the morning of June 13th. Simpson came back from Chicago about noon or 1. He gave blood about 2 that afternoon. And these other swatches were already at the crime lab or were already in transit. When Dr. Lee testified, the essence of what he had to say was that testimony had come from prosecution witnesses that because the blood had been picked up early and placed in the packets that it was stored in, it was dry by the time it got to the lab, or it was dry at a given point in the lab. But when the defense looked at those same packets, they were wet. And Dr. Lee's famous pronouncement was, something's wrong.
I remember one of the prosecuting attorneys, I can't remember which one, made a statement saying in his cross-examination of Dr. Lee, isn't it true that the distinction between wet and dry is sort of fuzzy? And Dr. Lee looked at him and in his ever-gracious manner sort of told him where to get off, and he said, the distinction between wet and dry is not fuzzy at all, which I thought was a very dramatic and yet largely undercovered point in the trial.
And several jurors said, if you watch them in interviews, after all this was over, they said Dr. Lee was the most impressive witness in the trial. I mean, he, like him or not like him, he did make a great impression on some of those jurors. But that was what he was, it was hard to follow some of what was being done in that trial, particularly on the part of the defense. But that was what he was getting at, was that those were not the same swatches.
There was one of the things, and we're going to talk about this more in a few minutes, Stephen. Racism pervaded all aspects of this trial, and in the many condemnations of the jury that took place in the media afterwards, the impugning of their intellect, and the supposition being that because they were black, they weren't smart enough to follow all this evidence, was one of the most pernicious, and yet Dr. Lee's testimony was among the most technically sophisticated, and they certainly appeared to be quite capable of not only grasping, but understanding the import of what he had to say.
If you listen to the jurors they interviewed after the verdict, they talked about the evidence. They did what they were there to do. They did what the public didn't do, what the media has never done, what the prosecution refused to do consistently throughout the entire trial. They dealt with the evidence. And when they talked, what did they talk about? I mean, the gloves didn't fit. They talked about EDTA. I was rather amazed that several came out and specifically focused in on it and said something was in that blood. They talked about the blood being missing from the vial. The 8 cc's or milliliters were drawn from Simpson's arm, and there were only 6. There were only 6 later on. What happened to the other 2? They talked about that. So I think it's would not be a surprise to anyone to believe that there are policemen on the LAPD who have racist tendencies. I don't think they were shocked by that, and I think they were perfectly capable of convicting Simpson in spite of that. I don't think they acquitted him because of Furman. I don't think they acquitted him because of the Furman tapes. I think they acquitted him because they looked at the evidence and they could not come up with anything but reasonable doubt.
There appears to have been more than reasonable doubt about some aspects of the blood in the Bronco. Your source indicated to you that that was suspect as well, and some of the things that came out during the course of the trial tended to support that.
There were photographs. Barry Scheck was largely responsible for that, for some of the examination that went along with that. What happened was that, the Simpson's truck was impounded on the 13th of June. It was taken to the fingerprint shed there at the LAPD, and they took photographs of it, and on the 14th or the 15th, whatever. But there was more blood, according to photographs and according to testimony, in the Bronco in August when they went back and took more samples than there was in mid-June. That's number one. Number two is that an LAPD detective, Kelly Moldorfer, who testified for the defense, was inside the Bronco on the 13th or the 14th. She was a detective who was involved in some of the aspects of the case at that time. She was inside the Bronco. She testified. I didn't see any blood. There was no blood on the seats. There was no blood on the console.
This from an LAPD detective?
This from an LAPD detective. So it's... it just, it really just doesn't add up, and it just never added up. And if they hadn't been so intent on solving this case in 2 or 3 days or 2 or 3 hours, perhaps, I think it would have gone in a very different direction, and I think they would have learned many, many other things.
Robert Shapiro, in his cross-examination of Detective Van Adder, also scored some points vis-a-vis Van Adder's initial written report of blood in the Bronco. Could you tell us about that?
Well, the key thing with Van Adder, as we all know, is that which squares precisely with what I was told, was that he transported that blood, back to Rockingham, and which was an outrageous thing to do, and which they never had any answer for. And I referred earlier to the 2 missing milliliters that if they were, what I was told, and this has never been proven, it has never come out. You will not read it in any of the books, is that a syringe was inserted into that vial and blood was drawn out. And if you look at the blood drops, many of the blood drops associated with OJ Simpson, they are very round, they are very neat, they are very symmetrical. They do not look like blood that has flown off of somebody running as fast as he can, or something of that nature. The blood at his house and other blood looks like this.
We should note for formal legal purposes that no one has ever been charged with a crime of framing O.J. Simpson.
That's true. That is very true.
Now, I also want to note, Stephen, that one of the things Johnny Cochran pointed out was that the crime scene was broken down unusually quickly, and yet the blood sample from the back gate was taken months afterward.
The crime scene was broken down about 3:45 on that Monday, June 13th, which just seems extraordinarily fast. And then what happened later that day and later on was, you may have seen pictures of this on television, is that some of Nicole's friends, went over there and washed all the blood off the pavement. Whose blood was it? There was enough blood there to cover, Bundy Street, and it's all gone. And when they tried to bring in scientific evidence that there was blood present that didn't belong to anybody, it was a very difficult thing to do. However, LAPD's detectives again testified on behalf of the defense that there were 17 sets of fingerprints there that didn't belong to anybody. Whose are those? But the blood on the gate that you referred to was taken on July 3rd. The crimes were committed on June 12th. It was broken down the following day, as you said, in mid-afternoon. And the point being, how did that blood get there 3 weeks later?
Indeed, not 3 weeks, but it was taken a long time, not months rather, but it was taken a long time after the crime scene was broken down, and that was a remarkably quick process. Stephen, in your book, you have a number of speculative elements from your source about what may actually have happened, and one of these concerned the possibility that the initial target of the killers, and I believe your source mentioned there were 4 at one point?
There have been more than one report of that. That is not unique to me.
Because I had never heard, I heard speculation. I personally, from the get-go, did not think that this was something that could have been committed by a single person in that time. And given the absence of marks and the absence of blood on OJ in the timeline, I simply felt it was impossible. It was a fantastically bloody and violent struggle, and it just seemed preposterous to believe that one individual could have done that. I had not heard of any other. In your book, there's one passage where you discuss the possibility of 4 killers. I had not heard any of the other accounts. Could you enlighten us about those?
About what? I'm sorry?
About the other accounts of the possibility of more.
Well, there was the one woman who was going to testify to that, and she was more or less destroyed before she had a chance to do that, Marianne Gertrude. She did not prove to be a very credible witness.
She had some criminal charges.
Yeah, that was information that was reported at that time. There were several other people who talked about it. Pat McKenna, who was another leading investigator, was on Larry King about a week or so ago, and he was talking about witnesses that he has spoken with who also saw multiple people there, and he has tried to get this person to come forward and talk about it, and they simply will not do it. I mean, of all the very interesting things that have surfaced, you know, you've had several sort of public figures say, well, I'll give somebody $1 million if they'll just tell me who committed these crimes, as if it were that simple. Because if you start to think about, let's just speculate for the moment that O.J. Simpson didn't commit these crimes, and let's take the investigation in another direction. Let's do what the police didn't do. You know, this crime, they tried to solve this crime without ever conducting an investigation because an investigation was never done. There were 2 people at this crime scene. There were 2 victims, not just one. That has been overlooked entirely throughout the entirety of this case. That's number 1. Number 2, if someone had information, why wouldn't they come forward? What would be a possible answer to that question?
Well, obviously, the killers are still at large, and they won't exactly be doing the varsity rag at the thought of somebody ratting on them.
That's true.
And it would also appear, at least from a superficial standpoint, that whoever the killers were, they appeared to have a fair amount of, whoever the executive authority was in the killers, they appeared to have had a fair amount of clout, I guess one could say, in a general sense.
That's true.
You mentioned that your source informed you that, in all probability, or at least according to your source's information, that Nicole was not the original or main target of the killers.
I think it was something that has to be investigated, and it was never done. That's my overriding point. There was never a murder investigation done on this case. This case has been controlled by Mark Furman from the moment it began. That's why I presented the information to you as I have. We know from police officers going well back into his career that he had come forward and talked about Nicole Simpson. We know that he did not arrive at that crime scene as a blank slate. We know that he talked to Phillips about it on the way over there because there's testimony to that effect, that he knew what went on between these people. He has controlled this case from the instant it began. And he is, I think we could safely conclude, based upon what he has said about himself over the last 20 years, at best disturbed. That is what has controlled the media's perception of this case. That is what has controlled the public's perception of this case. That is what has controlled the state of California's perception of this case. They have been wrong about Furman on every single count. I mean, they tried to set him up as not being a racist, and it failed miserably. And they have not yet come to grips with what this means. But the other part of the internal affairs investigation that I referred to a long time ago that was conducted in February of 1995 was that one of the original charges was that he was putting swastikas on the lockers of other policemen, particularly if they, as in one example, had a Jewish spouse.
That was a Detective Purdy.
That's correct. But when push came to shove, they did not want to deal with this either, and it was simply whitewashed and pushed under the rug, and Mr. Furman was allowed to go on and do his job, as he was for 20 years.
Weren't there initially reports that a check of fingerprints inside of Detective Purdy's locker confirmed that, at least according to the information presented in the report initially, Furman had actually done that?
That's correct.
That, again, has never been proved in any formal legal sense, so we should note that for formal legal purposes here.
That's correct.
Mr. Furman has never been charged with any kind of crime in connection with that, and we should emphasize that.
But he did perjure himself during the trial, and they have not confronted that either. And it's not so much a matter of saying everybody did everything wrong. I mean, I'd like to be very clear in saying this. If you don't start with the appropriate assumptions, and if you don't do the job you're paid to do, you're not going to end up in the right place. And that's what happened in this case. They simply did not do the work that they are paid to do.
Before we get to the performance, Stephen, I think of the media, of the defense to a certain extent, of the prosecution, beyond that of the society as a whole, because I think in many ways the real significance, not only of the OJ Simpson case, but of the information that you have helped to throw, the light you have helped to throw on that, goes far larger than Mark Furman or any given participant or a series of participants in the case. But you mentioned in the course of your book that there was some information that connections in or around Aspen, Colorado, may have played an important part in what transpired.
There is a Mezzaluna restaurant in Aspen, Colorado, and it was something that I tried to investigate somewhat on my own. Time and again in this particular case, I found myself with information that I couldn't do anything with. I did not have the resources to do a lot of things I wanted to do. I talked to a number of people in Aspen and basically got the door slammed in my face.
Right.
Nobody wanted to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's fairly obvious what the connections are, and every time I brought it up, I was told that we're just not going to talk about this, in connection with the OJ Simpson case.
So it certainly seems like there are people who know more than they're willing to talk about, and they, too, are afraid.
And those people were never questioned in a serious manner by the police. And that's the way you solve a crime of this nature.
Just one second, Stephen. One of the things that you brought out in your book, Stephen, and that we've already touched on in connection with the internal affairs investigation of Mark Furman, is the possibility of a structural link, or a thematic link, perhaps we could say, between your first book, Talk to Death, and some of the forces that may have been involved in framing O.J. Simpson.
Well, what happened was that, as I point out in the book, is that I was given this information, but it was never made really clear to me why I was given it. For a considerable period of time, I was just told, here are pieces of evidence. See if this exists, and see if you can give this to the defense, and see if they can do anything with it. And that's about all I knew. I mean, I'd heard a lot of stories about Furman and read things in the New Yorker and other places, but I didn't know that much about him. In February of '95, about a week or so after the trial had started, as I write in the book, my wife was watching Good Morning America one morning, and I was upstairs working or doing something, and she came up and got me and said, "You better come down and watch this report on Furman." Furman had, as many of us know by now, had moved to Sandpoint, Idaho. Sandpoint, Idaho is where the murder weapon was found that killed Alan Berg. It was a known neo-Nazi enclave, at least in the mid-'80s it was, and had then become something of a retirement center for certain LAPD officers. Well, I thought this was certainly a curious coincidence that he would have ended up in the same place as the murder weapon, and then there were numerous media reports about that. So it became clear to me at that point why I had been given the information, that people inside the legal system knew that there are police officers who hold white supremacist beliefs, and they are extremely disruptive forces. And I think what you heard on the Furman tapes was precisely that.
There was a report in Newsweek magazine in the last week of March of 1995 that some fellow officers who'd been interviewed in connection with Mark Furman alleged that he was either involved with or the de facto head of a white supremacist group within LAPD called WASP, standing for White Anglo-Saxon Policemen.
Right.
That was in those were in some of the files vis-a-vis Furman that Judge Ito would not permit to be introduced into evidence. As far as I know, there has never been any overt confirmation of those allegations.
No. But that is why I was involved in the case. I mean, it fits hand in glove with what I wrote about 10 years ago in the Alan Berg case.
And that's, again, no pun intended.
Yeah, that's true. I would like to point out also that, just as a bit of an aside, that I have, after my book was published 3 or 4 months ago, I met a man named Donald Freed who's written a number of books, and he has a book coming out about the OJ Simpson case.
And by the way, he is a researcher whose work we have featured on this program before. I was not aware that you were in touch with him. He does an excellent work about the intelligence community and the JFK assassination.
If I could take a minute here, he called me out of the blue. I was not familiar with him. And I would like to point out that during the entirety of my involvement in the O.J. Simpson case, I was living in Denver. I was literally doing the best I could. I was not a part of the action here except in a very tangential sense. I did not have a staff working for me. I was completely self-employed, and there were a lot of things I couldn't do that I would have liked to have done. Mr. Freed has 6 people working on a book about the O.J. Simpson case. That book will be out in August or September. It's called Killing Time. It's published by Macmillan, and he is essentially going to go further down the road than I've gone in virtually every direction we're talking about. He has information in there about Furman's white supremacist connections that go far beyond what I've written.
All righty, Stephen, let's hold the discussion right there for a second. This is concluding this particular half-hour segment. We have been speaking with Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, subtitled An Investigation of Mark Furman and Racism in the LAPD, published in softcover by Dove Books in 1995.